America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. O beautiful for patriot dream that sees beyond the years, thine alabaster cities gleam undimmed by human tears.
This was the Europe of 1941. The Nazi blitzkrieg had overwhelmed France, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and Luxembourg. Russian armies were in desperate retreat. The German Air Force was raining death and destruction on England. Combined Italian and German forces were menacing Egypt. Their objective, to defeat an opposing British army and dominate all North Africa. In Asia, Japanese air and ground forces were driving forward in their bloody conquest of China. Only one of the world's major powers was still not at war, the United States. It was a Sunday afternoon in December 1941.
3 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed on Luzon's north coast. The following day, still another Japanese landing was made on Luzon's east coast. On the 21st of December, the main Japanese invasion force hit the eastern shore of the Lingayen Gulf. Troops came pouring ashore from 80 transports. The Japanese onslaught gave General MacArthur only one choice: fight a delaying action, try to regroup his forces. It was a monumental task. The Japanese had struck swiftly, suddenly, devastatingly. They pressed forward unchecked. To save Manila from war's destruction, General MacArthur declared it an open city. Ignoring such humanitarian consideration, the Japanese bombed Manila. On the last day of 1941, MacArthur withdrew to the mountainous terrain of the Bataan Peninsula, for Bataan and Corregidor commanded Manila Bay. The objective was to delay the enemy's entrance to the bay. MacArthur and his battling bastards of Bataan, as the troops in grim humor called themselves, knew they were fighting a losing battle. But they fought on, gaining precious time for us to recover from the disaster at Pearl Harbor and build up our forces.
Hollywood's most famous movie stars leave the film capital to help the government sell war bonds. Irene Dunn, Ronald Colman, Hedy Lamarr, Greer Garson, all part of a contingent of some 50 screen celebrities giving their time and talents to aid the national war effort. The country has asked the people to invest $1 billion in 1 month to help pay for the war. And here's the start of the drive. Boarding a special train for Washington, they'll tour 300 cities from coast to coast. Go to any city that agrees to subscribe at least $1 million. Yes, in democratic America, everybody is doing his bit. There goes Jimmy Stewart on his way to enlist. One of the most popular stars on the screen. Joining the Air Force as a private, Jimmy has now won promotion. Today, he's Lieutenant Stewart, USA. That husky young Negro en route to an Army induction center is the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, Joe Louis, the boy who beat Max Schmeling. The Army can use that fighting spirit, and Joe Louis is now a corporal of cavalry, somewhere in the West. Moviegoers of years ago will remember Jackie Coogan. Charlie Chaplin made him famous as the Kid. Well, Jackie's in the Air Force now, a staff sergeant and qualified glider pilot. A movie star of modern times is sworn into service. Tyrone Power, hero of many a daring exploit on the silver screens of the world. He'll now play his greatest role as a Leatherneck Marine. Somewhere in Egypt, President Roosevelt's eldest son, James, sees war as a major of Marines. Today, that experience stands him in good stead. For Communiqués report, Major James Roosevelt is with the Marines battling in the South Pacific. Franklin Roosevelt Jr. is in uniform. His fellow officer is Douglas Fairbanks Jr., a lieutenant in the Navy. Young Doug, like his famous father, every inch a man, is serving with the fleet. Clark Gable, at 41, renounces his throne as America's most popular film star to join the United States Army Air Force. Enlisting as a private, his ambition to become a crack aerial gunner in the crew of a bomber.
God bless you. Thank you.
Yes, movie stars arriving in Washington to help sell war bonds are all working for the same cause. The parade down Pennsylvania Avenue is a pageant of patriotism. Bing Crosby in a scout car. Jimmy Cagney. Abbott and Costello, popular comedians of stage, screen, and radio. They all assemble on the Treasury steps to launch the drive for funds. Greer Garson, Jimmy Cagney, Ann Rutherford, Irene Dunn, Hedy Lamarr. And how that crowd lines up to buy bonds from their favorites. They buy knowing that every dollar invested helps send more planes, tanks, and ships to the United Nations. This is the people's way of saying, from the home front to the battlefront, from movie stars to sales clerks, America's 130 million citizens are in the war.
There were other prime targets marked by the Japanese. They bombed British Singapore and its great naval base. The British fought back, but it was the same losing fight that our troops were waging in Bataan. On New Year's Day, 1942, the siege of Bataan began. Superior Japanese forces pounded our beleaguered troops for 3 long and agonizing months. On February 22nd, 1942, President Roosevelt ordered General MacArthur to leave the Philippines and proceed to Australia as Supreme Allied Commander in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur turned over his command to General Jonathan Wainwright. MacArthur made the first leg of his journey to Australia by PT boat through enemy-infested waters. And then by plane from Mindanao. Bataan fell on the 9th of April, 1942. Thousands of captured American and Filipino prisoners of war began their infamous death march. Hundreds were to die, felled by exhaustion and by the bayonets of their captors. To those self-designated battling bastards of Bataan who starved and fought on, the nation owes a debt it can never repay. Corregidor remained our last foothold. What once had seemed an impregnable rock fortress now awaited its inevitable doom. The fortunes of the United States and its allies were at their lowest ebb. But the Japanese were soon to learn that their homeland was vulnerable to surprise attack. April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle prepared to take off from the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet. Their target, Tokyo, and 4 other major Japanese cities with carefully selected military targets. It was only 9 days after the fall of Bataan. Never before had such a carrier-based operation been attempted. The psychological effects of the raid on Tokyo were even greater than the material damage inflicted. It raised the morale of all Americans. It shocked the enemy into realization that we had the will and the wherewithal to carry the war to the heart of his own homeland.
The world's mightiest bomber plant is rolling. Henry Ford welcomes British and U.S. war supply heads Oliver Littleton and Donald Nelson. The schedule, 1 bomber every hour. Second stop on their tour of inspection is the assembly line of a huge tank plant. 6 months ago, sleek, shiny automobiles were rolling through the grounds. Today, grim, heavy weapons of war are being readied for service at the front. On the Pacific coast, Workers in a bomber plant get a visit from America's hero of the hour, General James Doolittle, the man who led the first United States bombing raid on Tokyo. Addressing the men who built the ships that rained bombs on Japan, the general said, "Thanks for some great airplanes."
3 weeks later, United States Navy planes of a carrier task force struck the Japanese fleet a damaging blow in the Coral Sea. The first naval battle in history to be fought entirely with carrier-based aircraft. While the Navy was starting to make a comeback, General Wainwright surrendered Corregidor. A proud old soldier who had fought in World War I and who now at the age of 59 was surrendering his sword without cause for shame, for he and his men had fought in the finest tradition of the American fighting man. Our stubborn defense of Corregidor had put the Japanese conquest 4 months behind schedule and sent General Hama back to Japan, relieved of his command. In January of 1942, President Roosevelt had addressed Congress and the nation to set new and immediate production goals.
First, to increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes, 10,000. 10,000, by the way, more than the goal that we set a year and a half ago. This includes 45,000 combat planes, bombers, dive bombers, pursuit planes. The rate of increase will be maintained, continued, so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 125,000 airplanes, including 100,000 combat planes. Second, to increase our production rate of tanks so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 45,000 tanks, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 75,000 tanks. Third, to increase our production rate of anti-aircraft guns so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 20,000 of them, and to continue that increase so that next year, 1943, we shall produce 35,000 anti-aircraft guns. And fourth, to increase our production rate of merchant ships so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall build 8 million deadweight tons as compared with a 1941 completed production of 1,100,000.
Immense forces were mobilizing. Millions of Americans were in training. the infantry, airborne infantry, field artillery, anti-aircraft artillery, armored cavalry, Army Air Corps pilots by the thousands, woman power as well as manpower. The vitality of all America was surging up to full tide. American labor and management performed miracles. Planes, tanks, guns, ammunition. Tens of thousands of items rolled off the lines to supply not only ourselves, but our fighting allies. On the home front, 1942 was a momentous year. Great plans and stratagems were being laid and coordinated. Supplies by the millions of tons poured overseas. Nazi submarines took a heavy toll. But enough ships got through to help sustain our beleaguered allies. In the air, the tables were starting to turn. 1,000 Royal Air Force planes in a single massive saturation raid smashed Cologne, Germany. In the Pacific, our naval aircraft inflicted the first decisive defeat on a large Japanese fleet, winning the Battle of Midway.
Filmed under fire. These are the first pictures of America's great naval victory in the Pacific. Army, Navy, and Marine planes, cooperating with the fleet, surprise a Jap invasion force sent to capture strategic Midway Island, stepping stone to Hawaii and the North American continent. U.S. planes roaring to the attack amid a rain of anti-aircraft fire. Triumph. There would be others, but they would be slow in coming.
Listen, gents, I've been pushing the hack around New York for quite a couple of years, namely 22. It is my personal experience that there is more automobiles in said city than there is people. How would you like to have to navigate through this mob in order to make a nice couple of dollars? Well, I was going to retire and take up a new line of business until certain Japanazis decided to clop us on the chops. First result is I don't have to retire because this here war is made from traffic a dead macro. Right away, mobs decide they can put away the Buicks and use the feet. And I'm telling you, getting dead Story's face is worse than getting into the World Series. This, of course, has now eliminated the Sunday drivers. The way it is now, a person who wants to go from Greenpoint to Harlem has got to use the subways. So everybody is very happy with the possible exception of the street cleaning department, because a lot of people from Brooklyn had horses hidden under rocks from which they now have come out of retirement. Now I got something else in my mind. This is the old village after dark with the masses lighting up the double crossroads of the world, the main stem, the hardened artery. You're right, brother, good old Broadway. It was a kind of a pretty sight with the neons twinkle like little stars in sections like Flatbush and even Staten Island. Well, this here practice is now a memory. We got ourselves a dim on account of the way the ships stand out against our lights. So, come 6 o'clock, Fifth Avenue looks like it was in Hackensack, and I wouldn't have believed it. I also wouldn't have believed it if you said you couldn't go to Louis the grocer and buy all the tomato and pea soup you wanted, like, for instance, this doll is doing in the good old days before this war, on which you gents is an expert. A lot of you also had to have the Mizuma to pay for that hardtack. But that's not the problem now. You can have a zillion bucks, but the way it is now, you got to be a certified public accountant to buy a can of pork and beans. This improvement is what is known as rationing, which I will now explain to you. First, you got to add up what you got, like these ladies are doing. Then if what you got ain't enough, you start to make a list of what it takes to feed the relatives, the kids, and maybe a couple of old cousins thrown in. After you do this, you go and you stand on line to get a book, without which the grocery will positively give you a fisheye. But here comes the real pain in the neck, trying to juggle the points so that everything comes out. This makes filling out income taxes strictly for amateurs. And there are lots of people who now wish they hadn't played hooky when a teacher was given out with addition and subtraction. Because if you don't figure right, you have nothing to chew on but fresh vegetables, which is hay strictly for citizens that chew their cuds, or maybe rabbits. But even me and all the other characters in Manhattan ain't those. And this goes for all the citizens in the suburbs, which reaches to the Los Angeles county line. We know where the gas is going and the electric light bulbs and the ketchup. You're getting it, gents, and that's okay with us. Eat hearty, bub, and bring the pennant back to the guys who are sitting in the bleachers yelling for a home run.
America honors Army nurses who served under fire in the Philippines. Heroines of Manila, of Bataan and Corregidor, their deeds have written an epic chapter in U.S. history. Mrs. Roosevelt looks on as 6 who came back received medals for valor. To student nurses, their courage is an inspiration. Caring for the wounded until told to go, they were the last to leave. On the home front, women enlist for less glamorous, less hazardous, but equally important work in industry. Replacing men who are called to the colors, these girls are operating one of the nation's biggest lumber mills. Today, women in overalls, women in war jobs are to be found throughout the length and breadth of America. Even at Army proving grounds, the so-called weaker sex is doing a man-sized job. Testing tanks is just daily routine for this all-girl crew. On the firing range, they try out the latest machine guns. A 50-millimeter aerial defense weapon with plenty of kick. Manning anti-aircraft batteries, they feed shells and fire them with clockwork precision.
Our top military leaders were now taking the high places reserved for them by destiny. General Douglas MacArthur, commander in the Southwest Pacific, and Admiral Chester Nimitz. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was coordinating momentous plans with the Allied combined staff in the European theater of operations. General Leslie McNair, commanding general of all American ground forces. General Omar Bradley, commandant of the infantry school, soon to be given a top field command. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding Army Air Forces. General Brehon Somerville moved up to Chief of the Services of Supply with the stupendous task of logistical support for what would finally be an army of many millions deployed throughout the world. The first of our troops began arriving at overseas staging areas. In North Ireland, England, Australia. On bloody Guadalcanal, Army troops relieved battle-scarred and weary Marines to continue the fight for the Solomon Islands. The United States was demonstrating not only a will to fight, but the capability of fighting a two-front war against great odds on far-flung battlefronts half a world apart.
Guadalcanal Airport, the tiny patch of land for which Japan has sacrificed a fleet of warships and thousands of fighting men, still bristles with United States bombers. For the forces that control Guadalcanal command the approaches to Australia, hold mastery of the skies over the vitally important Solomon Islands. Today, these land-based bombers are leading the way as the combined United States land, sea, and air offensive begins the task of sweeping the Japs from the South Pacific. Plunging into malaria-infested jungles, the Marines steadily, doggedly enlarge their hold on the island. At an advanced base, they enjoy their first rest in weeks. They have the advantage of an uninterrupted supply line, and they get nothing but the best. Marines take no chances on being surprised by roving Jap patrols. Any line may be the front line on Guadalcanal, and they dig in as they advance. Machine guns always on the ready. Artillerymen back up the infantry, blasting the Japs from the island.
On the 8th of November, 1942, American amphibious forces struck the shores of North Africa. We were, to use an appropriate American phrase, in business. The business of an all-out fight against powerful aggressors who had reached out to conquer the world. We had come thousands of miles, but not for conquest. In 1942, the commander of our ground forces, General Leslie McNair, said it best.
The United States is stretching out its arms to encircle the globe, not in conquest, but in protection. Even with our powerful allies, the task is vast and calls for our utmost all-out effort.
Behind the scenes in a U.S. war plant, rushing the manufacture of Army Scout cars. Here is a vivid example of how the famous American auto assembly line has been converted to speed equipment for war. American engineering genius for mass production, getting things done in a hurry. In a matter of hours, the finished cars roll off the line and are driven to ports of embarkation. Yankee soldiers called them Jeeps, and the world will be seeing a lot of them. New to this war, they're the legs of America's motorized infantry. Atop a new Yukon trail a few miles from the Alaskan border, men of the famous Canadian Mounted Police join in opening the new United States to Alaska Highway, one of the greatest road-building feats of all time. Officials cut the ribbon barrier in simple tribute to the American Army engineers who blazed the vital pathway through the Arctic wilderness. Completed months ahead of schedule, the new 1,600-mile Alcon Highway sees the first truck convoy begin to roll. A new Northwest Passage linking the United States with Alaska. One year after entering the war, United States gains in naval tonnage shatter all records. Here, the Belleau Wood, laid down as a cruiser, goes down the ways. The third aircraft carrier launched within 3 months. At another shipyard, the carrier Bunker Hill is launched, one of 26 ships to slide down the ways in a single day. Queen of them all, the giant new USS New Jersey, mightiest battleship ever built. 5 stories high, she's the fastest afloat. Armament and guns, naval secrets. The New Jersey will soon be in action with the fleet.
By winter 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor, our Army fighting forces were building up fast and being deployed around the world, fighting beside Australian troops in New Guinea, on Guadalcanal, where they had taken over from the long embattled Marines. Large-scale amphibious landings had been made successfully in North Africa. Joining up with the British and the fighting French. Other Army units were arriving in overseas staging areas in North Ireland, England, and Australia. As our combat and support forces began to encircle the globe, our lengthening supply lines were stretched to the utmost. An army cannot fight without food, clothing, weapons, ammunition, medical supplies and services, transportation, armor, and aircraft that must be constantly supplied with fuel and as constantly serviced, repaired, or replaced. During the fighting of the vast stretches of arid desert land in North Africa, German General von Ravenstein, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, remarked that North Africa is a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's hell. An American or Allied commander could very well have made the same statement.
Mighty America had come fully alive. A revitalized agriculture reached the largest food production goals in the history of mankind. Food not only for ourselves and our allies, but for the hungry populations of the countries our armies would liberate and occupy. Industrial output staggered the imagination, brought renewed hope to our hard-pressed allies, dismay and consternation to the aggressors. It amazed even ourselves. At long last, the United States had come of age, had found a vitality, a strength, and a will to do that was phenomenal in all the annals of men and nations. Great convoys of ships stretched out as far as the eye could see, carrying the millions of tons of cargo we kept pouring overseas. All of this in support of G.I. Joe. And who was G.I. Joe? He was the oft-times grimy, unshaven, heart and soul, blood and guts of America, the citizen soldier, the immortal image of the American fighting man whose forefathers had starved and frozen at Valley Forge to fight on and triumph at Yorktown, and again a few years later at the Battle of New Orleans. He had been a raw recruit at Bull Run, but emerged the victor at Gettysburg and the winner of a great and tragic civil war at Appomattox. He was the man who drove the enemy to defeat at Chateau Thierry, at Saint Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne. He was and is the American soldier personified. And who were his leaders? Marshall, Eisenhower, MacArthur, McNair, Bradley, Devers, Patton, Clark, Hodges, Kruger, Eichelberger, Patch, men like MacAuliffe, men who possessed the indomitable spirit and genius of Washington. Winfield Scott, Andrew Jackson, Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, George G. Meade, Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing. This was the heritage of American military leadership in World War II. A heritage they could not and would not fail. Their one and only goal, victory. From buck privates to four-star generals, these were the priceless outpouring of America's greatest resource, the product of more than a century and a half of freedom, of democracy in action, of a great dream that their forefathers had fought for and made a reality, and which these, their sons, were fighting to preserve.